Just after midnight, the ranch went still in the wrong way. A pregnant mare had shattered her pen and vanished into the frost. And by the time Daniel Reeves found her tracks running toward the open field, the cold western wind was already carrying him toward something no rancher ever hopes to find alone. The night had settled into that deep, unmoving silence ranchers come to trust, the kind that means fences are holding, gates are latched, and every animal has found its place. The wind moved low across the open land, brushing through dry grass and along the wooden rails like a steady breath. Daniel Reeves was halfway between sleep and habit when something in that rhythm broke. It wasn't loud at first, just a strain, wood under pressure. Then a sharp, splintering crack that cut through the stillness and held there for a second too long. He was already sitting up before his mind caught up. Years on this land had trained his body to respond before questions formed. His boots waited by the bed. His coat hung where it always did. By the time the cold hit his face on the porch, he was awake in the only way that mattered. The yard lay open under a thin wash of moonlight. Nothing moved. No scattered horses, no drifting shapes where they shouldn't be. Just the low fences, the dark line of the barn, and the distant stretch of pasture fading into black. Then he saw it. The north pen stood at an angle it shouldn't. One corner had given way. Timber pulled outward, hinge twisted, the frame broken just enough for something strong, determined, and desperate to push through. Daniel crossed the yard without rushing, but without hesitation either. His breath came steady, visible in the cold as he reached the opening. He didn't need to check the tag on the gate. He already knew which horse had been kept there. Lila. He paused just outside the break, letting his eyes adjust before lifting the beam of his flashlight. The inside of the pen was empty. No pacing marks, no churned-up panic in the dirt. Just a quiet absence where a heavy-bodied mare had stood only hours before. That, more than the broken wood, tightened something in his chest. A frightened horse leaves a mess behind. Circles, scrapes. The story of panic written into the ground. This pen held none of that. Daniel lowered himself slowly, angling the light across the earth just beyond the opening. The ground there was harder, dusted with frost, but the marks were clear enough. Hoofprints pressed deep, spaced unevenly. Not the erratic scatter of a bolt, but something heavier, slower. He reached out, gloved fingers brushing the edge of one print. It was fresh, still sharp along the edges where the frost hadn't yet settled back in. "She didn't run," he murmured, more to steady his own thinking than to hear the words. The beam followed the line outward, across the yard, past the water trough, through a section of fence that hadn't been secured since afternoon chores, an oversight that now sat heavy in his mind. Beyond that, the land opened. The pasture rolled gently away from the ranch, flattening into a wide stretch of grass that seemed to swallow light. Under the moon, it looked almost endless. No trees, no shelter, just open ground and the low whisper of wind moving through it. Daniel straightened, letting his gaze travel along the faint path of prints as far as he could see. They didn't veer. They didn't double back. They led straight out. For a moment he stood there, weighing what he knew against what didn't make sense. Lila was close, too close to her time. He had been watching for signs, adjusting feed, keeping her separate from the others to reduce stress. Nothing in the past few days had pointed to this. Nothing except the way she'd gone quiet that evening. He exhaled slowly, the sound lost in the open air. There were choices in moments like this. Wait for daylight. Bring more hands. Take time to think through every possibility. But the cold didn't wait, and neither would whatever had driven her through that pen. Daniel tightened his coat and stepped past the broken rail, placing his boots carefully into the line of prints. Each one felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself were carrying the weight forward. Behind him the ranch remained still, unaware. Ahead, the darkness held its shape, unchanged. He moved into it anyway, following the marks out across the frost, toward a part of the land where the wind ran colder and the distance between things grew wider. Somewhere out there, Lila had chosen to go. And for the first time since he'd found the broken pen, Daniel felt it clearly. This wasn't a horse running away. It was a horse going somewhere she believed she had to be. He adjusted the beam of light lower, letting it guide his steps as the prints pulled him farther from the safety of fences and into the open field. The sound of his own footsteps faded against the grass. And somewhere ahead, too far to place but close enough to matter, the night carried a low, strained breath that didn't belong to the wind. He lifted his head, listening, then kept walking. The sound did not come again right away. Daniel stood still, letting the quiet settle back around him. But it wasn't the same quiet he had stepped into a few minutes ago. This one held something underneath it. Thin, strained, almost lost in the sweep of wind moving across the open land. He angled the flashlight lower and continued forward. The ground changed as he left the hard-packed yard behind. Frost clung to the grass in a brittle layer, snapping faintly under each step. The hoofprints were easier to read here, deeper, more defined, each one pressed down with a weight that told its own story. Not a run, a push. He followed at a steady pace, his eyes moving between the ground and the space ahead. The beam of light cut a narrow path through the dark, catching the edges of sagebrush, the uneven rise of the pasture, the long stretch of nothing beyond. Every few yards, the pattern shifted. A deeper print, a shorter stride, then a pause where the marks pressed into one place before moving again. Daniel slowed. He crouched once more, gloved hand hovering just above the ground before he let it touch the surface. The frost there had been disturbed, melted slightly, then refrozen. Something had lingered. "She stopped here," he said quietly. The wind answered, brushing past his shoulder and moving on. He lifted his hand and brought it closer to the light. There, faint but unmistakable, was a thin, dark streak against the pale frost. Not enough to alarm a stranger, enough to shift something in him. He looked up again, following the line. The prints continued, but not as straight as before. They angled slightly now, drifting toward a lower stretch of land where the grass grew taller and the ground held more moisture. It was a place horses sometimes chose to rest in the summer, when the heat pressed down and the shade of distance felt like relief. Tonight it offered no comfort. Daniel moved faster, though he kept his steps measured. Rushing blind in the dark helped no one, he knew that. Still, the space between each print felt shorter now, as if the distance itself had begun to close in. The wind picked up as he crossed a shallow dip in the land, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else. Faint, metallic, almost swallowed before it could be named. He reached the edge of the lower field and stopped. The grass here stood higher, brushing against his knees, each blade tipped with frost that caught the light in dull flashes. The hoofprints disappeared for a moment into the tangle, then reappeared again, closer together now, tighter. Daniel turned off the flashlight. Darkness rushed in, but so did the sound. It came clearer this time, a low, uneven breath. Not the steady rhythm of a horse at rest, not the sharp burst of fear, something slower, pulled through effort. He held his own breath, listening. There it was again, closer. Daniel didn't switch the light back on immediately. He let his eyes adjust, picking out shapes in the dim glow of the sky. A rise in the ground, a darker mass against the horizon. The faint shift of something that didn't belong to the wind. When he finally brought the light up, he kept it low, letting it spill across the ground instead of striking straight ahead. The beam caught the hoofprints again, but now they were different. The strides had shortened further. The depth of each print had increased, as if every step had been forced through resistance. and between them, barely visible, were marks that didn't match the pattern of hooves. He swallowed, the realization settling into place piece by piece. This wasn't just movement anymore. This was labor. Daniel moved forward carefully, angling to the side instead of walking straight in. Years of handling horses had taught him that the way you approached mattered as much as the fact that you approached at all. Another breath carried through the dark, stronger this time. He stepped onto a slight rise and paused. The shape ahead resolved slowly. A body, angled against the slope. Dark coat dampened along the neck and flank. Head lowered, then lifted again with effort. "Lila!" he said, not loudly, but with enough presence to be heard. The mare didn't bolt. She shifted. One hind leg trembled slightly as she adjusted her stance, then steadied. Her ears flicked back toward the sound of his voice, then forward again, as if her attention was split between him and something else. Daniel took another step, keeping his light low. From here he could see the tension running through her frame, the way her sides moved, the subtle tightening along her abdomen that came and went in waves. He stopped again. There was something about the way she held her ground that didn't fit a horse that had broken free in fear. No circling, no attempt to put distance between them. She stayed, guarding something. His gaze followed the direction of her head. At first there was nothing but grass, pressed down in an uneven patch just beyond her front legs. Then the beam shifted, and the shape in the grass shifted with it. Daniel felt his breath catch, not in surprise, but in the weight of understanding arriving all at once. He didn't move closer. Not yet. Because whatever lay in that flattened patch of cold grass wasn't just the reason she had come this far. It was the reason she had broken through the night to get here at all. Daniel didn't step forward. Not at first. He held where he was, letting the moment settle into something he could read without breaking it. The beam of his flashlight stayed low, grazing the ground just enough to shape the space between him and the mare. Lila stood on the slight rise, her body angled against the wind. Up close the strain was clearer now. Her coat, usually smooth and dull from the long winter, clung darker along her neck and shoulders. Each breath came uneven, pulled through effort rather than ease. But she didn't turn away. Her ears moved, back toward him, then forward again, as if she were listening in two directions at once. Daniel shifted his weight, taking a slow step to the right. He didn't want to come straight at her, not now. Not when whatever had brought her here still held her in place. The grass under his boots softened, bending instead of snapping like it had higher up. Moisture lingered here, trapped in the low ground. The air felt colder for it. Another step. The light followed, sliding across the uneven patch ahead of her front legs. At first, it was just a break in the pattern of the grass, flattened, darkened, pressed into the earth. Then the outline began to take shape. A curve. Too small to be another horse. Daniel's throat tightened, though his face didn't change. He lowered the beam further, letting it settle beside the shape instead of over it. There. A leg, thin, motionless at first glance, coated in a sheen that caught the light in a dull reflection. He stopped breathing for a moment, not out of fear, but to keep himself steady. "Easy," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Lila or to himself. The mare's head turned slightly, not away, not toward him, just enough to acknowledge the sound. Daniel took another step, slower than before. Now the shape was clearer. A small body lay on its side, half hidden in the pressed grass. The lines were delicate, unfinished in a way that only newborn life ever was. The surface of it still carried the marks of arrival, damp, fragile, unprepared for the cold that had already begun to settle into the ground beneath it. He crouched, careful to keep his movement low. The light angled just enough to reveal the chest. It moved. Barely, but it moved. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a controlled release that didn't disturb the air more than necessary. He set the flashlight down on the ground, letting it cast a steady glow rather than a searching one. Up close, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with small, uneven sounds, the faint pull of air into a chest that hadn't yet found its rhythm, the soft shift of Lila's weight behind him, the wind moving past all of it without stopping. He reached out, pausing halfway. There were rules to moments like this, not written down anywhere, but learned over years of watching how animals held on to their boundaries, especially when they had something to protect. Lila didn't move in. She didn't step away either. She held her ground. That was enough. Daniel closed the distance the rest of the way, his hand coming to rest lightly against the foal's neck. The skin was colder than it should have been, not frozen, but losing ground. "Come on," he murmured, voice low, steady. He slid his hand gently along the side of the small body, feeling for response. The muscles were there, but weak. The kind of weakness that came from arriving too soon or under the wrong conditions. He shifted his other hand toward the head, careful, deliberate. The nostrils were partially covered, a thin layer of fluid and grass pressed against them. Not enough to block completely, enough to slow what little air was getting through. Daniel worked quickly, but without urgency in his movements. He cleared the obstruction with his fingers, wiping it away against his sleeve. Then he adjusted the angle of the head, lifting it slightly so the airway opened more naturally. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the chest pulled deeper. A small, uneven inhale that expanded further than the last. "That's it," he said almost under his breath. Behind him, Lila shifted. He didn't turn. Instead, he kept one hand on the foal and angled his body just enough to stay visible without appearing to block access. It was a balance, presence without pressure. The mare took a step closer, her head lowered, nostrils flaring as she reached toward the small body. She paused just above it, then touched it with the soft edge of her muzzle. The contact was brief, but it carried weight. She drew back slightly, then returned, this time slower. Her tongue moved along the foal's neck in a deliberate stroke, pushing away moisture, bringing warmth where there had been none. Daniel eased his hand back an inch, giving her space without fully withdrawing. This wasn't something he could take over. It had to belong to her. Another breath from the foal. Still weak, but more present now. Daniel glanced up at the sky. The darkness hadn't lifted yet, but there was a thinning to it, a suggestion that time was moving whether they were ready for it or not. He reached for the radio at his side, keeping his movements contained. "Northfield," he said quietly into it. "Bring blankets. Keep the engine back." Static answered first, then a voice, faint but alert enough. Daniel set the radio down. His attention returned immediately to the space in front of him. The foal's head shifted a fraction under Lila's touch, not enough to lift, enough to show that something inside it was still trying. He looked at the mare then, really looked. Her sides were still moving hard from the effort she had gone through. Her legs held steady, but not without strain. She had broken through wood and crossed cold ground in this state, carrying the weight of her own body and what it was doing. And she had stopped here, not in the shelter of the pen, not within reach of help, out here, where the land offered nothing but distance and wind. Daniel understood it now in a way that didn't need words. She hadn't come out here to leave anything behind. She had come out here because something in her had decided this was where it had to happen. He adjusted his position again, shifting closer to the foal's side. The cold was still working against them, and the light, when it came, would not wait. Daniel didn't look back toward the ranch. There was no distance left to measure, no time to think in miles. Everything had narrowed to the small space between the mare's legs and the fragile body on the ground. He slipped off one glove, then the other. The cold bit into his hands immediately, sharp and direct, but it cleared his focus. He pressed his palm lightly against the foal's chest again, feeling the uneven rhythm. Still there, but not strong enough yet. "We've got a little time," he said quietly, not as reassurance, but as a boundary. He reached for his coat, pulling it free in one motion and spreading it across the grass. The fabric darkened as it took on moisture, but it would hold heat better than the ground. "Easy," he murmured again, as he slid his hands beneath the foal's neck and shoulder. The body was lighter than it should have been. He lifted just enough to shift it, not to take it away. The coat settled underneath, insulating the thin frame from the frost creeping up through the soil. Behind him, Lila tensed. He felt it before he saw it. The shift in her breathing, the tightening in the space around him. Daniel froze, holding the foal steady but not moving further. "It's all right," he said, voice low, even. The mare stepped closer, her breath brushing against his shoulder now. She lowered her head, inspecting what he had done. For a moment her presence pressed in, heavy and uncertain. Then she exhaled. A long, controlled breath that carried less tension than before. Daniel didn't turn toward her. He let the silence stretch until it settled again. When he moved next, it was slower. He rubbed the foal's side in short, firm strokes, working against the cold that had already begun to take hold. The small body responded with a faint twitch. Not much, but enough to hold on to. The radio crackled softly beside him. 2 minutes out, came the voice. Daniel picked it up, keeping his eyes on the foal. "Kill the headlights early," he said. "Keep it quiet." He set the radio down again and listened. The wind had shifted, carrying a low hum from the direction of the ranch, not loud, but approaching. Time was moving again. He looked at Lila. Her stance had changed, not relaxed, but steadier. She stayed close now, her head lowering again and again to touch the foal, to clear away what remained of birth and cold with careful, repeated motions. "She knows," Daniel said under his breath. He reached for the foal's head, adjusting it once more to keep the airway open. Each breath still came uneven, but it was coming. That mattered. A faint glow began to gather along the edge of the horizon. Not sunlight yet, but the suggestion of it. The truck appeared as a shadow first, then a shape, rolling to a stop farther back across the field. The engine cut before the doors opened. 2 figures stepped out, moving slower than they normally would. They knew better than to rush in. Daniel lifted a hand, signaling them to hold. They stopped where they were. He turned back to the foal. "We're going to move," he said softly. Not a command, a promise. He slid his hands beneath the small body again, this time preparing to lift more fully. The coat wrapped around it loosely, giving him something to hold without pressing too hard. The foal made a weak sound as the weight shifted. Lila stepped in immediately. Daniel paused. The mare's head came down, close. Too close for comfort if she had chosen otherwise. But she didn't push, she didn't strike. She stayed, watching. He adjusted his grip, keeping the movement low and controlled. The foal rose just enough to clear the ground, its weight barely registering, but its fragility unmistakable. "All right," he said, barely audible. He took one step back. Lila followed. Not aggressively, not uncertainly, simply staying with them. Daniel moved toward the waiting sled, each step deliberate. The grass slid beneath his boots, the frost giving way as the temperature slowly shifted with the coming light. Behind him, the mare kept pace, close enough that he could feel her presence without turning to check. The ranch hands moved in then, quiet and coordinated. One pulled the sled forward, laying down an extra blanket. The other held position, watching the mare, ready to step back if needed. Daniel lowered the foal onto the makeshift bed, adjusting the coat around it to trap what little warmth they had managed to build. For a second, everything held still. Then the sled shifted forward. Slow. Controlled. The path back wasn't straight. It curved slightly, avoiding uneven ground, keeping the movement as smooth as possible. Lila walked beside them, her head low, her steps careful. The first edge of sunlight broke across the horizon, thin and pale. It stretched across the field, touching the frost, the grass, the figures moving through it. Daniel didn't look at the light. He kept his focus on the sled, on the small rise and fall of the foal's chest. It was still there, still fighting. The distance back to the ranch felt longer than it had before, though he knew it wasn't. Every second carried weight now, measured not in steps, but in breaths. As they reached the broken edge of the pen, the world behind them began to wake. The stillness lifted. But what they carried forward didn't belong to the morning. It belonged to whatever came next. By the time they reached the yard, the light had settled into a pale, steady gray. The ranch no longer slept. Doors had opened. Shapes moved between the barn and the house. No one spoke loudly. They didn't need to. The way Daniel carried himself, the way the mare stayed close, told the story well enough. The sled slid to a stop just outside the foaling stall. Warm air met them as the door opened, dry, held in by wood and routine, by years of knowing that nights like this would come eventually. The contrast was immediate. After the cold field, the inside felt almost too still. "Bring him in slow," Daniel said, his voice low but certain now. He crouched again, hands steady despite the cold that had worked its way into his bones. The foal barely stirred as he lifted it, the weight still unsettling in its lightness. Inside, the stall had been prepared in minutes. Fresh straw spread thick. A heat lamp already hung low, casting a circle of amber that pushed the chill back just enough. Daniel lowered the foal onto the straw, adjusting the coat beneath it. "Easy," someone murmured from behind him, though it wasn't clear who it was meant for. Lila stepped in a second later. She hesitated at the threshold, just a fraction of a pause, then crossed into the stall and turned immediately toward the small body. Her attention never left it. The vet arrived not long after. No rush, no raised voices, just a quiet efficiency shaped by experience. Hands moved in practiced ways, checking temperature, listening for heart and breath, observing more than intervening. Daniel stepped back, giving space. For the first time since he'd left the house, he let his shoulders drop. The foal's breathing had changed, still uneven, but no longer slipping away between attempts. The chest rose a little deeper now, held a little longer before falling again. "Not strong," the vet said quietly, more to the room than to any one person, "but present." Daniel nodded. Present was enough. He moved to the side rail, resting one hand against the worn wood. From there he could see both of them, the mare and the foal, framed in that circle of light. Lila lowered her head again, her muzzle brushing along the foal's neck, then its shoulder. Each motion was deliberate, patient. She wasn't forcing anything, just staying with it. The kind of presence no one could replace. Minutes stretched, then an hour. The sky outside shifted from gray to a softer, warmer tone. Light filtered in through the small window, mixing with the glow of the lamp until the stall felt grounded again. Part of the ranch, not separate from it. The foal moved first. A small shift of the head, then a twitch along one foreleg. Not much. Enough to draw every eye in the stall closer. Daniel straightened slightly, though he didn't step forward. He had learned that part too, when not to interfere. "Let him try," the vet said. No one spoke after that. The foal gathered itself, slowly, as if unsure of its own structure. The legs tucked in, uneven, untested. The body leaned forward, then faltered. It collapsed back into the straw. Lila didn't react sharply. She stayed where she was, lowering her head again, touching, waiting. Another attempt came. This time the front legs held for a moment longer. The hind legs struggled to follow, trembling under a weight they weren't ready to carry. The foal rose, just enough. Then stood. For a second. 2. Long enough for the room to go completely still. Daniel felt the breath leave him without realizing he'd been holding it. The foal swayed, then settled back down into the straw, not falling, just returning. "That's enough," the vet said quietly. "That's a start?" Daniel nodded again, though the motion felt different now. Not relief, something steadier than that. He watched as the foal shifted once more, turning its head instinctively toward Lila. The mare responded immediately, adjusting her stance, guiding without force. A few minutes later, the foal found the space it needed. A small, uncertain latch, a brief pull, then another. It didn't last long, but it was real. Daniel stepped away from the rail then, moving toward the stall door. He didn't leave. He just needed a different angle to take it in. Outside, the ranch had fully woken. The sounds were familiar again. Tools, footsteps, the low murmur of voices beginning a new day. Inside, time had slowed. He looked back once more at the pair in the straw. The broken pen, the cold field, the long walk back. All of it felt distant now. Not unimportant. Just part of something that had already passed. What remained was here. A mare that had carried her young as far as she could. A foal that had chosen in small, quiet ways to keep trying. Daniel rested his hand against the doorframe. He understood something then. Not all at once, but enough to stay with him. Rescue didn't end when a gate was opened or a rope was cut. It didn't end in the moment you brought an animal home. It lived in nights like this, in decisions made without witness, in the space between losing something and holding it just long enough for it to find its footing. Behind him, the light shifted again, warmer now. Inside the stall, the foal gathered itself once more, legs folding under, preparing for another attempt. Daniel didn't move. He just watched and waited. Some stories don't end with certainty, only with quiet responsibility. What this night leaves behind is a reminder that rescuing a horse is not a single act, but a long commitment to life, patience, and care. If this moment stayed with you, there are more stories waiting, each one carrying its own truth across the open land.
If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts below and subscribe to Horse Heart Healing for more meaningful stories.